1919, the world was changing. The new enemy arrived not on the sea, but from the sky. Following the Great War, naval strategists understood the age of predictable ship-to-ship engagements was over. Transforming that theoretical threat into a practical defense, however, proved a Sisyphean struggle. It was constrained by the limits of human strength, analog computation, and bureaucratic inertia. The core challenge lay in time itself. How could they calculate the trajectory of an aircraft moving at 300 knots? They needed to predict where it would be seconds later. They also needed to set a fuse to explode precisely at that point. All of this had to happen while the ship beneath the gun was rolling and pitching violently. The solution involved the complex high-angle control systems, or HACs, used by the Royal Navy. The US Navy relied on sophisticated directors, such as the Mark 37. These devices were technological marvels. They acted as massive, clockwork brains designed to solve complex three-dimensional calculus in real time, yet they were monstrously complex to operate. For instance, the French M1930 and M1931 computer system was so immense it required up to 26 highly trained operators. These men were crammed into a single control station on a heavy cruiser. The Italian systems, though deemed about 10 years ahead of contemporary gear in design, were considered a little unwieldy. Their ambitious stabilization systems often suffered from persistent motor problems caused by water ingress through deck openings. Naval engineers, particularly in Germany, attempted to solve the stabilization problem with elaborate multi-axis gyro systems. The resulting machinery was later dismissed as a typical example of how high-angle stabilization and canted trunnion problems should not be solved. For the men operating these complex machines, the work was a relentless physical and mental strain. Gunners on the USS Minneapolis in 1934 criticized their early systems for their slow rate control and unreliable clutches. These flaws demanded constant, exhausting correction from the crews. In the British HACs, operators struggled to maintain the aiming line. They were often forced to assume speeds far higher than reality just to keep up with the target. Even small errors in estimating the angle of presentation could lead to massive deflection errors. These errors were compounded by internal system issues, such as the curvature of the log-R plot. This often resulted in predicted fuses being set too short. The installation of new mounting arrangements undoubtedly upset the rhythm of the crews. They wrestled with equipment that was temperamental, heavy, and often obscured by haze from smoke and powder gases. The rise of the dual-purpose gun in the US Navy, culminating in the famed 5-inch 38 caliber weapon, was a direct response to this crisis. But even this weapon had limits. Rear Admiral Luke McNamee voiced the growing alarm in 1929. He was concerned about the Navy's insufficient realization of the menace and the weakness of their present defense. The 5-inch 25 gun, a predecessor, was considered useless against dive bombers. It could only be effective if the planes were seen approaching in time to get the guns approximately on target before they began to dive. The engagement window was brutally short. A dive bomber had only about 30 seconds to reach its release altitude. Furthermore, the physical limitations of the sailors dictated the weapon's design. The 75-pound shell was considered the absolute maximum a man could physically lift from the hoist to the gun on a destroyer. Compounding this technological struggle was a critical failure of imagination. For years, the Royal Navy and US Navy relied on radio-controlled drones for target practice. While these improved gunnery skills, they could not execute realistic near-vertical dive-bombing maneuvers. This artificial training environment led to a critical, systemic underappreciation of the threat posed by dive bombers. The reality was starkly demonstrated in a 1931 exercise. In that test, battleships were deemed defenseless against aircraft diving out of the sun. The light armament intended for close-in defense offered little comfort. The US 0.30 caliber machine gun was useless. The 0.50 caliber was little better. It critically lacked the explosive shell needed to bring down a robust aircraft. The 50 caliber was failing to hit targets because it had been inadequately developed. It remained in service only until better alternatives could be found. Similarly, the Royal Navy's pom-pom guns, while prolific, were increasingly inadequate. They were especially ineffective when dive bombers used the sun or clouds to mask their approach. As the 1930s closed, the navies were locked in a desperate race. Pre-war doctrine had suggested that evasive maneuvering would have little effect on the aim of bombers. This was a myth that combat would brutally debunk. The reality was that evasive maneuvers became critical for survival. They forced pilots to jink and ruin their aim. But this tactical necessity only highlighted a deep, systemic flaw in naval doctrine. Massive, heavily armored capital ships, designed to fight each other, were entering a war for which their defenses were conceptually and technologically unprepared. They faced a threat they had consistently underestimated. The 30-second window was closing fast. 1940, spring. The first campaigns of the war were not just strategic defeats, they were technical assassinations. The opening battles in Norway and the chaotic evacuation at Dunkirk delivered a brutal confirmation. The aircraft, particularly the German dive bomber, was the new king of the battlefield. The Royal Navy's destroyers, the fleet's nimble workhorses, proved terrifyingly vulnerable. Earlier experiences had already highlighted the inadequacy of their existing anti-aircraft firepower. Combat now demanded immediate and costly adaptation. The shock was so profound that crews began to suffer from shell shock after enduring hours of sustained high-intensity air attacks. Engineers recognized the urgent need for higher gun elevation and improved tachymetric control. Most tellingly, they needed splinter-proof plating to protect the exposed anti-aircraft crews.
But it was the summer of 1941 that provided the definitive bloody verdict.
The Holocaust off Crete in May 1941 saw German Stukas sink fast, maneuverable destroyers with terrifying efficiency. This disaster forced the Admiralty to confront the fundamental limitations of its existing anti-aircraft batteries. It exposed the fatal flaw of relying on distant, land-based fighter support that rarely materialized. The shock was followed by a focused, urgent response. The German dive bomber attack on HMS Illustrious in January 1941 disabled the carrier and sent her limping back to port. The single attack served as the catalyst for immediate technological evolution. It directly spurred the design and development of the new battle-class destroyers, as these ships featured enhanced dual-purpose armament and fire control tailored specifically for the three-dimensional war. New tactics were desperately needed. This led to the formulation of the umbrella barrage by autumn 1942. Destroyers were tasked with creating a protective screen of shells bursting at set heights over the main fleet units. Yet Naval Command struggled to translate theory into effective practice. The Mediterranean Fleet's air defense instructions, drawing on early experiences, concluded that dive bombers were vulnerable to close-range anti-aircraft fire. The operational reality, however, often involved Italian torpedo bombers attacking from outside the effective range of standard short barrages as placed them 3,000 to 5,000 yards away. The defense was often firing too little, too late. The nadir of this evolving crisis came on the far side of the globe. In the autumn of 1941, Force Z was lost, the sinking of the battleship HMS Prince of Wales, and the battlecruiser HMS Repulse revealed a critical, unforgivable flaw. Massed Japanese air attacks demonstrated the danger of operating capital ships without organic fighter cover. The disaster underscored critical deficiencies in anti-torpedo bomber tactics. It showed a fatal over-reliance on complex powered systems that failed the moment the ships were crippled. Japanese pilots were initially surprised by the sheer volume of fire from Prince of Wales. That volume, however, ultimately proved inadequate to save the ship, and lesson was absolute. The battleship era was dead. This loss forced a fundamental re-evaluation of capital ship survivability. It accelerated the decision to prioritize the construction of light fleet carriers. As the war raged, technological deficiencies became impossible to ignore. The Royal Navy's proximity fuses failed, lacking the sensitivity and reliability needed to place shells close enough to targets. They stood in stark contrast to the emerging, superior United States systems. A scientific advisor to the Director of Naval Ordnance noted this reality with painful clarity. He stated that the U.S. Mark 37 gunfire control system with 5-inch guns was far superior to anything in the Royal Navy. This led to joint exercises where United States ships often had to delay firing. They held back simply because there were no targets left for the British to engage. This technological gap was compounded by deep bureaucratic inertia. The single most effective close-range weapon of the early war was the Swiss Oerlikon 20mm gun. Its adoption was delayed by bureaucratic resistance from entrenched Admiralty material departments. Figures like Stephen W. Roskell championed the gun, and comparative trials showed its superior effectiveness. Yet, the Admiralty departments delayed its widespread adoption. This was despite the weapon's remarkable simplicity. It required no supporting director, no wiring, and no power supply. Lord Mountbatten later famously argued, "We must have the Oerlikon because we can get it quickly." Nevertheless, the initial 6-month delay between trials and adoption cost valuable time and lives. The Oerlikon, often supplied by the United States, became the indispensable weapon for close-in defense. It protected thousands of smaller vessels and defensively equipped merchant ships, or DEMs. The ultimate test of endurance came during the desperate pedestal convoy in August 1942, and this was the brutal gauntlet run undertaken to resupply Malta. The operation represented a peak of sustained, overwhelming air attack. It forced the Royal Navy to confront the absolute limits of its defences. Relentless waves of Junkers, 88s, Heinkel 111 torpedo bombers and Stukas hammered the fleet. The escort was assembled in haste from disparate elements with different equipment and practices. It was thrown immediately into chaos. 9 of 14 fast merchant ships were sunk, alongside the carrier Eagle and the cruiser Manchester. The sheer intensity forced the convoy to execute 48 emergency turns just to evade attack over 3 days. Commodore Bodham-Wetton described the attacks as an endless plague of nightmare locusts. The psychological toll was profound. Commanders understood that the sustained air attacks wore down crews as much as they damaged ships. This was true even when the Italian bombing, which sometimes left ships completely enveloped in black smoke, proved deceptively ineffective. The gauntlet of pedestal confirmed that survival required more than just better guns and better fuses. It required superior operational coordination and a cohesive tactical doctrine. This was a lesson paid for in blood and tonnage. The bloody lessons of Crete, Foresaid, and the gauntlet of pedestal confirmed a terrifying truth. The battleship was obsolete, and the future of naval power belonged to the carrier. The carrier, however, had to first prove it could survive. For the U.S. Navy, the disaster at Pearl Harbor eliminated the slow, traditional battle line, ironically accelerated a strategic revolution. The focus shifted definitively to the Integrated Fast Carrier Task Force, or TF, structure. This new organization was built around a singular, massive technological brain. That brain was the Combat Information Center, or CIC. Evolving from British target indication techniques, the CIC became the nerve center of the fleet. It enabled the unified control necessary to coordinate both the fleet's fighter defense and the intricate surface anti-aircraft gunnery. The success of this integrated defense was quickly evident in the Pacific. Early convoy defenses, particularly those supported by escort carriers, demonstrated their worth. The combination of large fighter complements, effective fighter direction, and extensive destroyer screening could deter enemy torpedo bombers entirely. This was the critical realization for Allied command. Air defense was not just about shooting down planes. It was about establishing a layered defense in depth that made the attack too costly to execute. The backbone of the close-in defense was increasingly forged from 2 foreign designs. These were the Swiss Oerlikon 20mm and the Swedish Bofors 40mm guns. In the swirling chaos of a dive bomber attack, the power of these rapid-fire automatic weapons was undeniable. The Oerlikon, simple, rugged, and requiring no complex power or wiring, was the weapon of necessity. It was capable of spewing tracer fire that acted as an excellent deterrent to close and accurate air attack. As the attacks intensified, the Bofors 40mm became the weapon of choice for future construction. It offered superior ballistics and a much longer reach. The scene around a warship under air attack was a deafening, vibrating hell. Gun crews fought through the haze from smoke and the corrosive powder gases. They relied entirely on sheer volume of fire. The Bofors, often supplied in powerful quadruple mounts, delivered a concentrated, lethal stream of fire. During the pedestal convoy, the escort commander noted the harsh operational reality. It required escorts to swing broadside to unmask their anti-aircraft batteries. This maneuver risked inviting a torpedo hit, but it was necessary to bring the full weight of the guns to bear. The sheer volume of fire was designed to create a protective cloud, the umbrella barrage, that individual gunners knew only a direct hit or a very close burst truly mattered. They strained to hold a sight picture on a target jinking violently at 300 knots. Yet, Even the most dedicated gunner, using the most advanced director, was relying on a fundamentally flawed tool. That tool was the mechanical time fuse. The true technological leap, the absolute game-changer, arrived almost silently. It was the proximity fuse, also known as the VT, or variable time fuse. This fuse was a scientific triumph. It was an electronic device housed within the shell itself that contained a ruggedized radio transmitter and receiver. It was designed to detonate, not on contact, but when its radio waves detected the presence of an aircraft within approximately 70 feet. The development, led by Dr. Merle Tuve, was a monumental engineering challenge. The fuse had to withstand the crushing 20,000 G acceleration and 475 revolutions per second spin of a gun-fired shell. The first operational use came on January 5, 1943, aboard the cruiser Helena. The impact was immediate and profound. Where a standard shell provided a lethal area of perhaps 60 square feet, the VT-fused shell offered 3,000 square feet. This increased its effectiveness 50-fold. The effect on the fleet was instantaneous. By the war's end, VT-fused rounds accounted for half of all kills by the 5-inch caliber. This was despite being used in only 35% of 5-inch rounds fired. The 5-inch 38 caliber gun, previously effective only against high-altitude horizontal bombers, was suddenly transformed. It became a devastating anti-aircraft weapon for short-range engagements. Commander W.S. Parsons starkly assessed the breakthrough. He stated that a 3-month delay in bringing proximity fuses into service would be equivalent to the loss of a battleship. The days of relying on luck, precise fuse timing, and the hope of a direct hit were finally over. Now the sky was filled with lethal, invisible shrapnel. The VT fuse, coupled with the revolution in radar, gave the U.S. Navy a decisive advantage. The magnetron breakthrough in 1940 enabled the development of compact S-band and X-band radars. These systems provided unprecedented accuracy and allowed for blind-fire capability. Systems like the Mark 37 Director, now equipped with new radar, could track targets at 800 knots. Radar resurrected the fighter plane as the primary defensive weapon. It provided both early warning and precise direction for interception. Detection ranges soared to 50 nautical miles at 10,000 feet. This gave the fleet the precious time needed to launch and guide its Combat Air Patrol, or CAP. This technological and organizational superiority was soon tested in the massive engagements of 1942. The Battle of the Eastern Solomons in August of 1942 and the Battle of Santa Cruz in October were brutal, chaotic affairs. While the U.S. Navy suffered heavy carrier losses, the new integrated defense proved its resilience. The fast battleship USS North Carolina provided crucial anti-aircraft support. Her 5-inch guns forced Japanese aircraft to break off dives at altitudes between 4,000 and 6,000 feet. This effectively neutralized the supposedly impregnable dive bomber attack. For the gunners, the psychological strain was immense. They endured the deafening noise and the rapid, violent shifting of targets. Yet the North Carolina's commanding officer reported a remarkable success rate. He noted that when a director achieved a satisfactory track, the target was almost invariably shot down. The ultimate confirmation of U.S. dominance came in June 1944 at the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Americans would dub this engagement the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The U.S. Fast Carrier Task Force, designated TF-58 or 38, was now a cohesive multi-carrier behemoth. It unleashed the full power of its integrated defense, employing hundreds of Hellcat fighters. Guided by the Centralized Combat Information Center, the American fleet decimated massive Japanese airstrikes. The dominance of U.S. fighter direction and the sheer lethality of the VT-fused anti-aircraft fire were absolute. The Japanese attackers often died without achieving anything. Their conventional air attacks were rendered obsolete. This crushing defeat led the Japanese High Command to a horrifying conclusion. Conventional air attacks were no longer worthwhile. The era of the massed conventional airstrike was over. The only path left to them was one of desperation and self-immolation. The Battle of the Philippine Sea had delivered a verdict written in the wreckage of hundreds of Japanese aircraft. Conventional air attacks against the integrated, radar-guided defenses of the U.S. Fast Carrier Task Force were suicidal. With overwhelming technological and numerical inferiority, the Japanese High Command turned to a strategy that replaced skill with sacrifice. In October 1944, the philosophy of desperation was formally codified into doctrine. Admiral Onishi, the head of naval aviation, pressed his view that only suicide attacks offered a chance against the unstoppable U.S. carriers. He insisted that all participating pilots must be volunteers. The first formal naval suicide attack occurred on October 25, 1944. It struck the escort carriers Santee and Suwannee. This was not merely a new tactic. It was a fundamental shift that presented a qualitatively different threat. The kamikaze was not an aircraft to be shot down and avoided. It was a human-guided missile. It was capable of maintaining its momentum for up to 300 yards after absorbing a lethal hit. This new enemy immediately exposed the limitations of the hard-won anti-aircraft defenses. The Oerlikon 20mm gun, the reliable, simple workhorse of close-in defense, was suddenly found wanting. The British Pacific Fleet, confronting the new tactics, concluded grimly that the day of the Oerlikon is over. Even if a gunner poured a continuous stream of tracer fire into the fuselage, the pilot could often crash close enough to cause devastating damage. This was because the pilot was driven by his final mission. The U.S. Navy launched into urgent anti-kamikaze refits. The focus shifted dramatically, prioritizing the 40mm Bofors and the 5-inch 38 gun. These guns were now firing the lethal proximity fuse over the smaller 20mm weapons. Memos stressed the critical need for weapons capable of fully destroying the aircraft at range. Planners recognized that one rapid-fire 3-inch gun could equal the effectiveness of 10 40mm guns against the highest speed threats, like the new Japanese Baka bomb. The Baka, or manned rocket-powered bomb, was the horrific culmination of this desperate technological race. Conceived by Ensign Mitsui Ota, this glider carried a 1,200-kilogram warhead and was powered by rockets. It was released from a mother bomber. Its rapid acceleration and small target profile presented gunners with extremely limited firing time. It was a primitive but effective guided munition. Allied observers grimly recognized it as a weapon of the future. The U.S. Navy, too, had entered the guided munitions race with the Bat missile, the secondary. This was a radar-guided weapon carrying a 1,000-pound bomb. Though promising in theory, the Bat's operational deployment was fraught with difficulty. Privateer squadrons found that insufficient training time meant pilots and radar operators lacked the crucial teamwork needed for success. Furthermore, the missile's radar was often confused by the dense echoes from Japanese harbors. Despite thousands being produced, the Bat's combat results were dismal. It frequently overshot targets or went wild. This proved that even advanced technology could fail without perfected integration and training. While the Americans struggled with their new complex weapons, the Japanese fleet was collapsing under the weight of its own technological stagnation. Their anti-aircraft defenses were incapable of tracking fast, maneuvering Allied aircraft. This forced crews to rely on unaimed barrage fire. This was a costly, ineffective tactic against the precise, coordinated U.S. air groups. Japanese fire control systems, still rooted in interwar design philosophies, struggled to keep pace with targets exceeding 200 knots. They had not adopted the U.S.-style circular formations that provided interlocking fields of fire. This left their massive capital ships vulnerable to simultaneous multidirectional attacks. The ultimate proof of the battleship's obsolescence came in the final months of the war. The sinking of the colossal Musashi in October 1944 had already demonstrated. One fact, even the largest warship ever built could be overwhelmed by sheer air power. The final lesson was delivered on April 7, 1945. The Japanese super battleship Yamato, sister ship to the Musashi, sailed on a one-way mission. The attack was a symphony of destruction. It was a flawless demonstration of the U.S. Navy's integrated air power. 386 aircraft from multiple task groups descended upon the lone battleship. The American strategy focused on saturation and flak suppression. They flew in waves that kept the Yamato's already inadequate gun crews reeling. The Japanese were firing barrage after barrage, but the shells burst uselessly around the rapidly maneuvering U.S. planes. Torpedo after torpedo slammed into the Yamato's hull. These hits were followed by armor-piercing bombs that hammered the deck. The executive officer and engineering officer, meticulously documenting the event in their surviving notebooks, recorded the relentless punishment. Hit after hit crippled the magnificent vessel. They recorded at least 9 torpedoes and 4 bombs. Down by the bow, and listing heavily, the ship slowed. It was unable to maneuver or fight effectively. The massive coordinated assault proved too much for the giant ship. Finally, a catastrophic internal magazine explosion tore the battleship apart. It sent a towering column of smoke and fire into the sky. This was a searing visual epitaph for the age of the dreadnought. The destruction of the Yamato cemented a strategic reality. The kamikaze attacks had failed to achieve their ultimate goal. Despite the tremendous psychological shock and the sinking or damaging of hundreds of vessels, Allied naval power was not crippled. The US Navy's continuous and relentless adaptation provided the ultimate defense. This included the rapid deployment of the proximity fuse. It also featured the sophistication of radar-guided intercepts. Crucially, it relied upon the standardized and resilient task force doctrine. The desperate tactics of the Japanese endgame were terrifying. However, they could not overcome the vast technological and industrial gap. The kamikaze, a primitive guided missile, signaled the end of naval gunnery dominance. This was proven only after the US Navy survived the ultimate test of human sacrifice. The war had concluded, and the path forward was suddenly clear. The future of naval defense lay not with the gun, but with the guided missile. The war ended not with a bang, but with a series of frantic, desperate memos. These documents confirmed that the age of the naval gun was finally over. The kamikaze had delivered the final terrifying verdict. As early as 1946, the Royal Navy acknowledged a fundamental problem. The issue was the rapid decrease in the chance of hitting with increased time of flight. It was a losing struggle against the rising speed of jet aircraft. The sheer velocity of the new generation of fighters meant shells took too long to reach their target. Even shells armed with proximity fuses suffered from this limitation. The tactical time available to engage a threat had compressed to near zero. This realization was coupled with the profound lessons learned off Okinawa. The saturation of fleet air defense by numerous, simultaneous suicide raids had overwhelmed even the most advanced radar plots. This drove an immediate and urgent shift in focus. The kamikaze experience highlighted critical deficiencies not just in the guns themselves. It also exposed the limitations of analog fire control systems. These systems struggled to synchronize and prioritize multiple incoming threats. Engineers knew the solution lay in the digital realm. However, that technology was still nascent. For the Royal Navy, this technological transition was brutally constrained by post-war economic austerity. National reconstruction took precedence over naval modernization, as forced the Admiralty into a period of painful compromise. The ambitious plan to develop and deploy most new gun systems was delayed until the mid-1950s. They were aiming for a 1957 service entry date. This meant the fleet, facing the dawn of the jet age, was forced to rely on obsolescent equipment. This equipment had been designed for the slower targets of the 1930s. It was a period defined by the grim necessity of putting new wine in old bottles. The notorious GRU stabilizer, a wartime modification to the Hacks, symbolized this struggle. It proved to be such a source of trouble that a destroyer once had to return to Singapore. The ship was disabled simply due to a single broken wire in the complex mechanism. The US, though far wealthier, also faced a severe defense budget crisis in the late 1940s, yet the lessons of the Pacific were too fresh to ignore. The US Navy poured resources into developing the next generation of fire control. They focused on integrated electronic solutions. These systems needed to handle the speed and complexity of the new threat. The goal was to replace the mechanical logic of the MEMCAR 37 system. That director was so crowded and complicated that even its designers deemed it too complex. The future required electronic computers. The US advanced rapidly, laying the groundwork for true digital fire control. New systems like the Mark 68 were planned for the new Forrest Sherman-class destroyers. The Mk-68 featured an electronic below-decks computer and SPG-53 radar. It was capable of tracking targets moving at 800 knots. Bell Telephone Laboratories developed a 10-target simulator. This simulator featured 4 directors and 4 guns. It used a ringing bell to indicate simulated kills. Engineers were trying to replicate the terrifying saturation attacks of Okinawa in a controlled environment. The ultimate goal was automated target evaluation and assignment, or ATAWA. This was a system that could think faster than any human crew. But the outbreak of the Korean War in 1950 shattered the delicate timeline for transition. The sudden influx of defense money accelerated the implementation of wartime programs. However, it forced the costly production of interim systems. This diverted crucial funds from long-term missile projects. The pursuit of the ultimate anti-aircraft gun continued. This resulted in ambitious yet often flawed weapons. The twin 3-inch 70 caliber gun was conceived as the successor to the 5-inch 54 caliber. It became a spectacular failure of US post-war ordnance technology. The weapon was notorious for jamming and unreliability. The automatic 5-inch 54 caliber gun had to be derated from 40 to 28 rounds per minute due to similar issues. In this atmosphere of technological chaos, the Royal Navy experimented with the future. Despite its limited budget, they focused on the guided missile. The development of the Sea Slug missile consumed most of the available ordnance money. It transformed the long-range fire control system project into the first generation of missile guidance systems. The transition was certainly not smooth. Sea Slug was initially deemed unsatisfactory. Nevertheless, it represented the inevitable direction of naval warfare. Meanwhile, the Seacat missile emerged as a more practical and effective successor to the Bofors guns. It was intended for close-range defense. The Seacat became a widely exported symbol of British technological ingenuity. The legacy of World War II anti-aircraft warfare was clear. The war had been the crucible that accelerated the development of radar, the proximity fuse, and integrated fire control. These technologies provided the foundational components for the future. They established the necessity of targeting data, remote power control systems, and centralized command. These components were all necessary for the development of modern naval-guided missile defense. The final fate of the gun was sealed not by a single defeat, but by the relentless march of speed. The Royal Navy's post-war medium-caliber gun remained the wartime twin 4.5-inch until at least 1970. This was a stark physical reminder that while the future had arrived in the form of the missile, the fleet was still fighting the ghosts of the past. They were using the weapons of yesterday. The continuous struggle to balance cost, technological advancement, and operational effectiveness defined the next era of global conflict. The gap between the theoretical ideal and the reliable reality of naval defense would endure. If you value these historical accounts, please subscribe to the channel and like this video. It helps us preserve these important stories. And please, share your own memories or thoughts in the comments below.